Hello, everyone. This is Jamie Henkel, Learning and Inclusion Manager at PFLAG National. My pronouns are she and her, and we are here today for Something to Talk About Live. Thank you all so much for joining us. And as always, I'm happy to introduce my colleague, my teammate, my partner in crime, Jean Marie Nevada.
Hello, Jamie. How are you?
I'm good. I'm a little bit bummed about waking up in the dark right now, but that's like the worst thing going for me, so I feel like I'm doing pretty good.
I'm glad. And I'm glad that Portland's doing okay too.
All right, well, take it away.
Thank you. We'll talk to you later. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Something to Talk About. My name is Jean Marie Nevada, and I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National. Every single week, we get together to have a conversation about an article that we found interesting, and we bring in different friends to have the conversation with us. So I will tell you, we are extremely excited and have a lot of anticipation about this week's article. As we chose it, we knew that it was probably going to get some people's dander up. And that is actually exactly the reason that we discussed it. So what we are going to be talking about is about a week ago, Eric Trump, the son of the president, seemed to accidentally announce that he happened to be a member of the LGBTQ community and then clarified that he actually isn't. But it raised a lot of issues about how do we support people, and do we welcome people who probably, or we know do have views that are necessarily harmful or maybe in opposition to equality and inclusion? And does everyone deserve to be included and to be supported in the LGBTQ space? So that is a big philosophical question. There's a lot of controversy around it, but here's the neat thing. I have really, really smart people coming on to help us along. So I would like to introduce actually PFLAG's chapter engagement team and bring everybody into the conversation so that way we can have everybody do hello. We can do a very quick round of introductions, and then we are going to get into the conversation. So we have more people than we normally chat with, and I'm so excited because we get to introduce our newest team member, Raquel. And I was wondering if you would be really, really quickly introduce yourself, and then we'll do introductions and get into questions.
Very new, very trans, very happy to be here. Quick enough?
Oh my gosh, that was perfect. That was the best introduction ever. Now you've really kind of made it hard for the rest of us who talk too much. Sean and Michelle, quickly reintroduce yourselves to people.
Hi, I'm Sean. Not new, but also trans.
So I'm Sashal. My pronouns are she, her, and not new as well.
So for those of us who are old and those of us who are new, we are really excited about the article. So for those of you joining in our audience, we definitely want you to be part of the conversation. The way you get this week's article is go to straightforequality.org/discussion series, and you'll be able to access today's article as well as the discussion questions that we are doing. So this week's article was entitled Eric Trump Roasted on Internet After Saying He's Part of the LGBT Community. It was written by Joseph Wilkinson, and it appeared originally in the New York Daily News. So we have got a lot of interesting conversation about this, because when it appeared that he came out as LGBT, there was certainly a response from the community, and it tended to not be particularly happy to see him. And a lot of us can understand why. And so I actually want to start with our newest guest first and ask you, do you think that the response that people had was understandable? So that's part one. And then part two is, do you think that kind of response was appropriate?
So thank you for the welcome again. Part one, I totally understood the response. I watched TikTok and there were immediately so many memes and jokes about Eric Trump coming out, speculation over whether it was real or not, and some pretty funny jokes. But I really, in addition to that, understand people immediately saying, you're not part of our community. We don't want you at Pride. Because, there is a contradiction when there's an LGBTQ person whose parents' policies have actively harmed the community, from withdrawing protections for trans folks in schools and work to removing trans folks from the Affordable Care Act and appointing Supreme Court justices who may overturn marriage equality. The list goes on and on. And, I personally apply my queerness to progressive politics. I feel that I'm queer, so I must advocate for all marginalized folks and do social justice work, which is why I'm really proud to work for PFLAG, where advocacy is really central to its mission. But after I initially laughed a lot at the memes about Eric Trump coming out by accident, it shifted a bit more to empathy, because I know from my own personal story and many loved ones' experiences that coming out in a conservative environment, if this was a real coming out, can be really difficult. So though immediately rejecting Eric Trump is understandable, I don't think it's too appropriate, because I'm thinking about what kind of message rejecting him will send to all the queer kids who were raised in a conservative home, just like I was. And while I see queerness as meaning that I personally must have a certain politic, having other politics doesn't actually make you any less LGBTQ. Like, for example, I'm Jewish, and Ivanka is a Jew by choice, and she's married to Jared. And there's been lots of people policing their Jewishness, saying that they're not Jewish enough, talking about like, oh, they worked on a Saturday, so they're not really Jewish. Do they really keep kosher, this and that? Regardless of what I think of them as people, they are Jewish. I can't change that. But I also then hold them to a standard of them being accountable in the position that they're in for when the administration upholds white supremacy or upholds anti-Semitism or things like that. So similarly, that's how I feel if Eric Trump was LGBTQ. I'd be like, all right, you're part of the community, but also do something about everything that the administration is doing for our community.
Excellent. And I think you made some really I love the parallel that you made. And I sort of like your approach, which is you certainly are welcome to join us, but you're going to need to make it right now. And let's try to get you up to speed. Sean, Seychelle, any additional thoughts on this one? Understandable / appropriate?
Understandable for sure. Appropriate, not so much. Like after that initial moment of, oh, is this a real thing? What do we do with this? I feel like my approach is always to be intentionally inclusive of everyone who says they're part of our community. And like being LGBTQ is just one part of someone's identity and who they are as a person. And I sort of kind of thought, well, what would happen if J.K. Rowling came out as trans like tomorrow? What would my reaction be? My reaction would be like, you're here, you're my sibling, you're good. Let's talk about how we can learn and move forward and help you understand how some of your actions have been harmful to other folks and what it means to be part of this community and show up in community for one another.
Seychelle, any thoughts on that one about did you feel it was understandable?
I definitely understood the reactions and the memes and the jokes, but looking at it also like how so much of the community was like rejecting of him, really echoed a lot of the harm of like how we feel like being a part of the community myself, how feeling rejected a part of that community if he really was, which made me do some internal thinking. But I do understand the climate, and I completely agree with the rest of what the team said here.
Yeah, it's interesting. As we were talking about this and thinking about this, I kept thinking about how horrified we are when somebody tells the story of being rejected by their faith community because they're queer. And we are the first ones to come to their defense. And yet we were pretty quick. A lot of people were pretty quick to say you have no place here. And I thought it's an interesting double standard. Although I agree with all you, I think it was completely understandable because it is just such a tough one. So I think this actually brings us perfectly into that second question, which is how, for people who hold more conservative views, or let's say views that are actually in opposition to equality, to inclusion, to even fairness, how do we welcome those people? Like, what does that process look like? And I really wanted to have this conversation, especially with this team, because so much of what we do is often encountering people at their worst moments when they're really not where they need to be on these issues. So what does that welcome look like? What does that process look like? And actually, I was wondering if maybe, Sean, we can start with you on this one.
Yeah, sure. I think I'm always a fan of like looking to the past to see how we inform how we move forward. And so for me, thinking about coming out, 15 years ago in the trans community and how within the community we sort of policed ourselves and gatekept ourselves in certain ways. I know that some people were not allowed in trans spaces if they weren't accessing medical transition during different periods, but now if we look at it now and the inclusion of non-binary trans folks, and I could be, if that was my expression, I could be like a femme trans man and nobody in the community would bat an eye anymore, where that wasn't the case 15 years ago. So thinking about that and how we really think about our own evolution or growth as a community, how can we apply that and give that to other people and say, look, I know this is where you're at. How do we move forward together? Here's what I've experienced. This is what we see as a community, and this is where we've been. Let's move forward together and figure out how this works. And some of that is like really uncomfortable conversation with folks and like leaning in. And some of that is knowing when to say, you know what, I can't actually have this conversation right now. Let's do it at a later time, or let's talk about it differently.
And I think that's actually a fascinating point that I don't think necessarily came up, that some of us may be better equipped to have these conversations and to do this kind of work than others. Either it has to do with the kind of skills that you've acquired along the way. And certainly, working at PFLAG, I noticed that Toby from our membership actually said we meet people where they are. That is an acquired skill. It's not something that automatically comes to a lot of people. So I think in some cases where we have people who have a little bit more training on it, it's good to lean into people like that, as well as those of us who maybe haven't had to experience trauma around some of these issues. And I think it's very difficult when people are put into those roles to fix those sort of things. Raquel, Seychelle, can you add to this? Can you give any other examples that you maybe have of how this shows up in experiences that you've had where this kind of meeting people where they are and figuring out how to move forward actually looks like?
Listening to this question made me kind of think about like my own journey a little bit of like being bisexual, and part of the question was, how do you accept an LGBTQ plus person who has these conflicting identities? And I couldn't imagine it being not accepted because I'm currently dating a male, or so therefore I'm no longer queer enough, or a part of or being deemed as bi, or raising a part of my identity. And that's true for all identities as an individual. So I wouldn't want to do that personally to anybody else. And it's really, truly understanding and believing people for saying who they are.
Yeah. So I want to move into our third question, because I actually think there's probably a lot that we can talk about here. And I'd be interested to hear from the people who are participating about what this meeting people where they are really looks like. So we all have a lot of stories around this, especially if you work at PFLAG. This is kind of what we do. I'd love to hear about what this looks like, because you hear this phrase, meet people where they are, all the time. I don't think we always fully understand what that means and how difficult that work can be, and how sometimes it goes really well and sometimes it does not necessarily. Seychelle, do you want to build into any of the meeting people where they are? Can you give any examples of sort of what those conversations have had to look like for you?
Sure. A lot of the times I have to remind myself I'm not the protagonist in other people's stories. And sometimes you're not even a supporting role or a cast member, because exposure is key. They may not know another LGBTQ person. Hopefully that is not the case, but that is very much the reality for some folks. Or they haven't had to interact with the identity that they're dealing with. You have to disarm yourself to kind of listen, to be able to understand the roadmap of where they're coming from, and kind of putting aside some of the biases you may have personally, just to listen. And that goes a long way when someone feels like you're genuinely listening to them and wanting to know and connect. They may reveal things that fill in the dots for you. So a lot of it's really just like disarming myself, and also being in a place to be able to educate, but also being receptive and acknowledging where they are,
I have to tell you, I just wrote down the words "disarm yourself," because I think that is a phenomenal way of putting this idea that we kind of need to go into these conversations. I always talk about the hot buttons, knowing which hot buttons that I have that you may press, and knowing that it's my job to manage what comes out of my mouth after that. And it goes to this idea of disarming yourself and really being present to what people have. Raquel, do you have any examples or of how this has looked for you, this meeting people where they are and what the process looks like?
Yeah, this has been a huge part of my personal journey. Coming from a background that wasn't very affirming of queer folks, I really have had to embrace people's capacity for transformation and change, both in my personal life with like reconciling relationships with family members, and then also professionally. Like I've canvassed on trans rights, and you're at someone's door trying to convince them why you shouldn't be discriminated against in public places. And facts and figures can change some people's minds sometimes, but I think personal stories are really the way to connect with people and transform them. And I attended a workshop on transforming people with narratives, and a gay man was speaking there who said, it took me like 10 years to be able to accept myself and come to terms with my identity. So why shouldn't I allow other folks that same grace and that time to come to it as well? And some people come to it right away. They just immediately are down with the cause, and that's amazing. But I think also really extending that patience and empathy with others, and being able to really have conversations with them that I'm not obligated to have. Like trans people don't have to put themselves in a potentially triggering situation to defend their rights to people. But if I choose to be in, do that type of advocacy work, be in those communities, have those conversations, then I'm going to bring that level of patience there to really change someone's hearts and minds.
And I think that that's a really great point, and I'm glad that you mentioned it, because I think we often struggle with this idea of who's responsible for meeting people where they are and what kind of conversations need to happen. And often this conversation ends up falling on the backs and on the shoulders of queer people who often have to do it. Although I think we are seeing more and more cases of where our allies are picking up the mantle and being able to have some of these conversations for us. I mean, certainly if you've ever been to a PFLAG meeting, you certainly know what that looks like, and you certainly know sort of what meeting people where they are actually looks like. But I think it's really kind of a great call to action and reminder to our allies that we can't always be the ones doing these things, that sometimes we're going to need other people to have the conversations, and those conversations will sound different than they do if it's a queer person, but it's certainly a different kind of conversation. Sean, any examples of how this has popped up for you or what it's looked like for you?
I think for me, it's most often come up in religious communities. So I was also sort of in a very conservative family situation. And so having to meet my family where they were was a challenge for me, because I didn't necessarily have the language that I needed. So for me, like looking into how I could educate myself further to match the level of other people who had this information that they were sharing with me, but I didn't have any information to share back with them. So being able to say, hey, this is a thing that this is my understanding of this thing that let's figure out how we can sort of meet it. But also very similar, like make sure that you're sharing your story personally and just being authentic and real, and knowing your hot button stuff is huge. Because I know if someone says a certain phrase to me, I'm just like, nope, I'm done. Gotta go.
The last question that we sort of didn't plan on talking about, but I definitely want to give people something to do. We always talk about PFLAG. It's great that we're talking about the issues, but it's really important that we're giving people things that they can use. I was wondering, and because of course I know that nobody ever wants to come on this again because I come up with these questions at the last minute, and I'm apologizing in advance, but sorry, not sorry. It's a good question. Here is my question for everybody. When you find yourselves in these moments of having to meet somebody where they are, and it's a really difficult conversation, I think all three of us can talk, or all four of us can talk about what that looks like. I would love if each one of us, and I'll even do it, I don't know what my answer is yet, could suggest one strategy that you've learned along the way that you think is really important to keep in mind going into these tough conversations where you feel like, frankly, I sometimes feel like people are stepping on my identity, to be honest with you. So, and I'm not going to ask anybody to go first. I'm going to sit here in silence and stare at you with lots of expectations.
I'll go. I think one of the ways that I enter this conversation, or I see I'm starting to engage in a conversation. I try not to look at it as winning or losing. It's really looking into it of like going back to hearing. Because if I want to hear their point of views and how they form their argument, or where they're coming from. So I can also do parallels in my talking points to kind of relate back. So it becomes a conversation rather than, well, ABC from this side, ABC on this side. I want it to be an exchange of ideas and really like, really prepare. If I'm not looking at it like I need to win this debate, or I need to win, I need you to completely agree with me walking away. That's not always going to happen, because there's so much conflict with there's so many conflicting points of views in all journeys and all situations that it's just best not to look at it as I need to be the winner, but more so looking at like, what can I give someone to take away with? So
you're so right. I think, going into it, I'm going to win this one. Like, I need to win this argument. I mean, and we do, because you want to prove that what you're saying is, I think that's a brilliant one. Who wants to go next?
I can. So that sort of ties in really closely to what I thought of as well. And it's that in sort of entering into a community or a relationship with someone puts you in this position where you can learn from one another. And so not having that mindset of, oh, I want to go in and win, but instead I want to leave our conversation having changed, I think is something that's just always great to keep in mind, and to be able to continue the conversation longer term, because we know this change doesn't happen overnight. Like it's not a one-time interaction, it's a long-term, keep coming back to it kind of thing.
Yeah, you've entered the story midstream. Don't expect that one conversation will shift it up. For hell.
Thank you for all the good answers. Yeah, definitely agree that it's a process, which can be hard if you're like canvassing or something. I mean, which you can't really do now, but and you can think like, oh, I'm about to have a 2-minute conversation with someone and change their mind on the issue. I think like that's the reason that PFLAG is such a powerful and successful organization, that for a lot of folks, it takes until a loved one or like family member like comes out to start this process. So I think, telling, like I said before, like telling those stories, really listening, not looking at it as a debate, like folks have said, and instead listening to what is it that they actually feel about this issue? Are there other examples in their life that you can draw from that like compare to like, is there a time that they felt marginalized? Is there a time that they have felt judged? And because it can also be really hard to understand what it's like to be trans if you're cis and have never thought about those things. So yeah, I think really listening and having a longer conversation.
I love the finding common ground. I always say to people, not everyone can relate to what it's like to come out or disclose, but everyone can relate to what it's like to worry that people aren't going to accept you anymore. Everyone's been there for something at some point, and find that common ground thing. I know that it has been super busy in the chat. I want to see if Jamie can come back with us, or if it's a little bit too crazy today, because I can probably always help if you want to pop in and let me know how it's going.
No, the first thing that I want to do is apologize very profusely to you all and to the folks that are watching. We did get a little bit comment bombed on YouTube, and as I was attempting to block a user, a comment that I didn't want to pop up popped up. So I'm very and truly sorry for that to the 4 of you and to our viewers. But there was a question that came up that I think is a really good one, and somebody was wondering if you have any recommendations on sort of classes or workshops or resources on how to use personal stories and personal narratives to defend rights and to defend diversity and inclusion in these conversations.
Can I be totally self-promoting for PFLAG? I have to be. I totally have to be. Everybody's like, yes, you can. You work there. I have to say PFLAG does an amazing training called Telling Your Story to Create Change. Sean is actually going to be doing it in a conference in a couple of weeks, and it is one of my favorite trainings of all time. We are hopefully going to bring it online for PFLAG Academy sometime really soon. But if you're connected to PFLAG chapters, check in with them and see if they have training on storytelling. It is learning how to do it in a quick bite. We teach people in a 2-minute snap of how to do your story. I have seen people's hearts and minds just completely transform in the span of that one. It's one of my favorites. And it's not just because it's a PFLAG one. I just think it's a quick, effective one. I don't know if any of my colleagues have any other trainings they'd mention except for the PFLAG one.
That's where my head went to right away. So
we're all trained well here at PFLAG. I would say anything that teaches you how to do storytelling is really effective. I mean, like literally anything that teaches you how to create structure. It's not what you're telling, it's how you're telling it.
Yeah, and I was going to throw out that I think that there are some great LGBTQ plus specific resources from the Toastmasters organization that can be helpful for folks if one of their fears is not in telling their story and sharing that narrative, but in public speaking, or if they're introverted and even in that one-on-one conversation, it makes them nervous. They have some really great resources. So I will put that in the chat, but it's something we mentioned in that PFLAG session. And a lot of the other things that we saw in the comments just had to do with sort of how people were feeling about this particular article. And someone shared that they were loving the conversation and they were really happy to hear what you all were saying, but commented on the fact that in this particular circumstance, that someone like Eric Trump is not going to be welcome in their life until they show a sign of remorse or understanding of why people had that initial reaction. So is there anything there that folks would like to comment on or say, or sort of how you would react to what that person shared with us?
I love the distinction between being in the community versus being in someone's personal life, because I think about that with not just when it comes to queer issues or issues of queerphobia, but if someone has caused you harm and that being your decision whether or not to welcome them into your circle and rebuilding that trust, the ball is in the court of the person who's been harmed. So while it may not be up to you whether or not he is at a particular pride parade, but I think not just thinking in Eric Trump, but the symbolism of Eric Trump for people that are in the community, of making sure that you personally feel safe with who you have your own connections with.
I also appreciate the comment because it talked about creating a boundary of yes, this individual, if they're coming out and being a part of the community, fine, but there's some work that needs to be done there for the struggle within where they are in their journey, right in that place at point in time. And it doesn't negate that because you are apart, but it also just shows there's some more work to be done. So I appreciate the boundary aspect of it.
Agree.
Yeah, and I would add that I'm going to throw my own personal opinion, because why not? I'm allowed. That when I was reading this article and when we were all talking about it to prepare for today, I think that for me, that is a distinction, that there are likely people in my life that hold more conservative views than I do and may vote for different candidates than I do. And that's all fine. But in the story about Eric Trump, he is in a position of power. He is in a position where he has impact on policy that influences a lot of people in a lot of different ways. And that access to power is something that complicates this conversation for me. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And we did get a couple extra call outs for Toastmasters. So I wanted to share that with you all, because I know it's a resource Jean Marie loves.
It's the for grown-ups.
And there were also a lot of folks today that really wanted to celebrate the power of that personal story. That when you share those personal stories, that it really does have an impact and make a difference. So I'm just pulling up a couple of those examples right now. But we are at the end of the session, and so thank you all so much. And we're going to turn it over to Jean Marie to close us out.
Thank you, everybody. You were incredible, and welcome. So it has been another very something to talk about. Oh, I think I'm back. I disappeared. And it was a very philosophical issue that was going on there. Do I exist or don't I exist? And how do we know on the internet? So anyway, it was a very interesting week. We definitely had some great debate here, and I'm really excited about that. And I'm always excited to hear people talking about their stories. So just a quick reminder, if you need support for coming out, regardless of who you are, regardless of how you identify, and regardless of what you believe, you definitely want to check out your local PFLAG chapter. And you can do that by visiting pflag.org/find. Many of our chapters are doing online services, so COVID has not stopped us. As we remind everybody at the end of every show, run fast, laugh hard, and most of all, be kind. But even more importantly, and I have a totally new mask this week, please continue to wear your mask because masks save lives. Until we can all be in the same room together, we're sending lots of remote PFLAG hugs. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. We'll see you again next week on Something to Talk About Live.